Many people fondly remember their college years. It's the time of youth, filled with the desire to grow and the strength to write one's own life story. However, the dreams of some young people are treacherous and cruel. The worst part is that sometimes they dare to fulfill them, leaving a bloody trail in the fates of the innocent. Eric Franklin Plunkett was born in 1981 in Portland, Oregon, USA. He was a friendly and cheerful young man who grew up in a loving family with an older sister. His parents' names were Lise and Craig. When the young people met, they quickly found many commonalities and realized they couldn't live without each other, so they began planning a move to Los Angeles. The young couple wanted to build their careers, but fate had other plans. Soon, the lovers found out they were expecting a child. They were happy that a baby girl was born, and at the beginning of 1981, Louise became pregnant again. However, the second pregnancy was more challenging because, during this time, the woman contracted rubella, a disease that is practically harmless in childhood but can lead to serious consequences and even miscarriage in adulthood. There was a significant risk that the baby would be born with severe deformities, including brain malformations. When the baby was born in September 1981, he initially appeared outwardly healthy. After 3 months, however, the mother noticed health problems with Eric. He did not react to loud noises, and some motor functions were difficult for him. So the mother took her baby to the doctor. The doctor diagnosed a mild form of cerebral insufficiency. The child had problems with his legs and was 100% deaf. There was and is no cure for these problems. However, the mother and father did not give up. They constantly supported their child and did their best to enable him to live a largely normal life. When Eric was 1 year old, he was sent to a special school to learn sign language. The whole family also began to learn it, but his older sister mastered it the fastest, so an early close bond developed between the children. Despite his problems, the boy was independent from childhood and considered himself a real fighter who defied all disabilities and never gave up. Thanks to this fact and the support of his family, he was able to lead a completely normal life. Only in sports was he never active. Cerebral palsy weakened his legs. Eric could not ride a bicycle and had difficulty climbing stairs. When Eric turned 12, he told his parents that he wanted to go to a boarding school. It was a special institution for the deaf. The boy wanted to be among his peers. It was hard for his mother to make this decision, but she understood that Eric wanted to find friends. Eventually, the teenager achieved his goal. Around the same time, the couple began to drift apart, and so Louise and Craig divorced in the 1990s. In May 1996, when Eric was 14 years old, his father married another woman named Lois. Lois had 3 children from her previous marriage who moved in with their stepfather. Eric loved spending time with them on weekends and during holidays. His mother's love life was also not idle. She began dating Christopher Wayne Cornell, who turned out to be the owner of a profitable company. This time was difficult for Eric, but gradually he accepted all the changes in his parents' lives and his own. When Eric's mother received a good job offer in 1997, she decided to move to Minnesota with her children and her new lover. In February 1999, Louise got married, and shortly afterward, she was expecting another child. In August 1999, Eric got a younger sister named Shan. During this time, he attended a boarding school for the deaf, where he also made friends. He dreamed of becoming a psychologist and helping people who were struggling with the same problems as he was. To this end, he wanted to study at Gallaudet University, a unique educational institution known worldwide for its programs specifically designed for the deaf and hard of hearing. There, all the prerequisites were created for a comfortable education for people with special needs. To get there, the young man dedicated all his free time to his college. Eventually, this determined young man graduated from his college with honors. This happened in May 2000. He mastered the sciences so well that he received several awards for his academic achievements. It seemed that his dream of studying at Gallaudet was coming true. However, he still had to qualify for the university. At the beginning of the year 2000, about 2,000 students were studying there. Despite its reputation as one of the best universities in the United States, the campus was located in a rather criminal area of Washington, about 12 minutes from the city center. Shortly before the events described above, there was a veritable cocaine boom in the city, which only worsened the situation. The local university was considered the safest place in the city, and Eric had been accepted within its walls. Now he had to undertake a long journey to study far from his family. His mother was very worried about this, but she had to let her son go to fulfill his dream. Eric quickly became part of the student body. He was very friendly and shared everything he had. The student immediately set up his room according to his preferences and hung all the walls with family photos. Due to his sociability, the boy quickly made contacts with the other students. On September 8th, Eric celebrated his 19th birthday. By this time, he had already built close relationships with several people. One of his best friends was a guy named Thomas Minch. He was a very creative person and lived in a neighboring dormitory. His circle also included his modest but loyal friend Benjamin Warner and the 22-year-old Joseph Mesa, who attended the university with his girlfriend. He was generally an open person, so much so that he had an open-door policy in his room. He owned a large collection of videotapes with various films, which he willingly shared with anyone who wanted them. It was not unusual for other students to come by, take what they liked without asking, and leave again. This happened on September 6, when the man was talking to his sister, with the camera oriented so that the girl had a full view of his room. At that moment, someone came in, took something, and left immediately. When she asked what that was, Eric replied, "It was okay." This surprised her greatly because she thought her brother was too careless when it came to his safety. Later, the teenager's mother joined the conversation. They had a short talk as she was working and very busy. Later, she regretted this very much. Had she known that this was the last time she would see her son alive, she would have paid more attention to the conversation. On September 28th of that year, all the students of the university gathered in Coxwell Hall. The lectures were already over. During this time, a student named Lauren was on campus duty on the ground floor. After classes, one of Eric's friends, named Joseph Mesa, approached her and told her that his buddy was supposed to come for tutoring at 8 p.m., but he hadn't shown up. Normally, this wouldn't be a cause for concern, but Joseph noticed several suspicious details. Eric hadn't been in the morning lecture at the university, which was uncharacteristic for him. Eric's room was not open as it usually was. This time, it was locked, which was entirely untypical for him. The guy didn't respond to knocking or attempts to contact him. Additionally, a very unpleasant smell emanated from behind the closed door, which smelled neither of alcohol nor of grass, as is typical for a student dormitory. All these facts alarmed the duty officer, and she decided to see what was happening. However, she was too shy to go into the men's wing of the dormitory herself. The woman called her male colleague on duty for help, who, together with her, knocked on Eric's door. However, there was no answer. So the duty officer used his special key, which could open any dormitory door. When they entered the room and turned on the light, the first thing they saw was a large amount of blood on the carpet. A trail of blood led from the computer desk, and in the middle of the room lay Eric in a pool of blood. His acquaintances knew that the young man could have had a seizure during which he lost consciousness. Lauren suspected that he had just had a seizure during which the student had fallen and hit his head. Everyone was in shock. They ran out of the room to call an ambulance and the campus police. When the paramedics and security personnel arrived at the scene, they declared the young man dead. They also immediately determined that it was a violent death. It was neither a seizure nor an accident. The local police arrived at the building soon after. For safety reasons, all students and staff were promptly evacuated from the campus, and a murder investigation was initiated. Although the university was located in a crime-ridden neighborhood, what had happened was new for Gallaudet. Similar attacks had not occurred here before. After examining the crime scene, the forensic doctors discovered some important details. The victim lay in a pool of his own blood. Eric's neck was broken. Near the body lay broken glasses and a piece of scalp with hair. It was determined that the perpetrator may have used a chair to inflict the injuries. Initially, the cause of death was assumed to be blunt skull trauma. It was obvious that the murderer had become enraged, which is why he inflicted such a large number of blows on his victim, far more than was necessary to kill him. It could have been a case of personal hostility. The police took the body and sent it to the forensic laboratory. At the same time, the family of the deceased in Burnsville, Minnesota, was having dinner. Suddenly, they heard a knock at the door, and when they opened it, 2 police officers were standing there. The parents were informed of the death of Eric Plunkett, who had just started studying a month ago and had tragically lost his life. The young man's family was shocked and took the first flight to Washington. There they found their son's room cordoned off by police officers. The investigations were still ongoing, but there were no clues. At this point, the investigators had very little information. It was known that the attacker had entered the room unnoticed, which was not surprising since this door was always open for guests. There were no signs of a struggle, and the victim's computer was still functioning. Nevertheless, checking the browser tabs and taking fingerprints from the mouse and keyboard did not yield any DNA traces of the unknown person. As soon as the victim's family introduced themselves to the police, they were immediately invited to the station for questioning. The investigators couldn't wait for the family to emotionally process the heavy loss. They needed to gather potentially useful information for the investigation as quickly as possible. The sister provided most of the information as she was very close to the murdered man. She called her brother almost daily via video call, sometimes even several times a day. The last conversation took place on the eve of the murder, on September 27th. But she couldn't notice anything suspicious. Eric neither spoke of being threatened by someone, nor was he afraid of anyone. After consulting with the investigators, the mother of the deceased was asked to come to the morgue to identify her son. But to avoid further traumatizing the woman, this was taken over by stepfather Chris. He confirmed that the murdered person was the 18-year-old Eric. The event shocked the entire campus. Without any apparent reason, one of the nicest, most open, and successful students was murdered. All courses were canceled indefinitely, the campus was cordoned off, and the residents huddled together wherever they could. The students were not even allowed to take their belongings that could help with the investigations. They had to sleep in rooms with their friends. The tension was palpable. Added to this was the frightening fact that the perpetrator was still at large and possibly among the students. Many students were forced to leave the university to await the outcome of the investigations. The investigators began to question all students and faculty members, especially those who were directly connected to the victim of the crime. The once lively university became a veritable ghost town. The only major event was the memorial service, where the students carried a large poster with Eric's picture. Everyone left wishes and signatures on it to support the victim's family. After these events, the victim's family could no longer stay here. They returned to their home state without getting answers to their tormenting questions. Meanwhile, the police officers continued to interact with people. Although they were real professionals, they encountered deaf and hard-of-hearing individuals for the first time, where the usual system for evaluating behavior, facial expressions, and voice intonation did not work. All this significantly complicated the investigation process and the interrogations and required much more than the police usually need. A few days later, the coroner's autopsy report came in. According to the autopsy report, Eric had been strangled. After he lost consciousness, several brutal blows with blunt objects were inflicted on his head, which killed the man. They were so severe that part of his scalp was torn off and his neck broken. Based on this information, the time of death could be determined more precisely. Considering that the young man had not participated in the last meals and lectures, the brutal attack must have taken place between the evening of the 27th and the morning of the 28th. The most likely time was the night of September 27th to 28th. Many more people had to be checked. Joseph, a neighbor, said he had seen the victim arguing with Thomas Minch shortly before the murder. The funeral of the murdered man took place on October 3rd. At the same time, the police arrested one of the students on suspicion of murder. It turned out to be Thomas Minch, a friend of Eric. He was the one with whom the victim had had an argument shortly before his death. During the interrogation, the investigators found out that the two had constantly argued. According to the young man, he was at a theater rehearsal on the evening of the murder day. But as it turned out, Thomas had free time around 8 p.m., so he had a short time span that could be sufficient to commit the crime. During the interrogation, the young man was visibly nervous. The investigators suspected that the motive for the attack could have been the argument between them. Overall, the interrogation of Thomas lasted about 6 hours. While he initially completely denied the police speculations, his statements changed in the further course of the conversation. In the 5th hour of interrogation, the man admitted that he had indeed wanted to visit his friend Eric after the theater rehearsal. At this point, his buddy began to hit on him, which he didn't like, and Thomas made it clear to his friend with force that he wasn't interested. However, Thomas continued to insist that he hadn't killed his fellow student. He simply pushed him away and left, but no one believed his words. The day after the interrogation, the investigators believed they had enough evidence to arrest and charge him, and they took him into custody. However, Thomas again denied his involvement in the murder. His lawyer argued that the investigators did not have the amount of evidence required for an arrest. Eventually, the man was released, and all charges were dropped. But what had happened had already dealt a severe blow to the young man's reputation. Thomas even received several threatening letters in which he was urged to leave the campus as he would be next. Consequently, the dean decided to expel Thomas from the university for safety reasons. At the same time, additional security measures were taken on campus. That is, numerous new cameras were installed throughout the facility, and more security personnel were hired to guard the grounds. The university administration then requested the police to complete the inspection of the grounds and allow the university to continue running as usual. This request was granted, and classes at the university were resumed. However, the investigation into the crime continued. 30 days after Eric's death, the police obtained a search warrant, and the investigators returned to the room where the deceased had lived. The reason for this was the receipt of information that on the day of the murder, someone had used the man's bank card and made several purchases in various stores in the city. It could not be ruled out that the deceased had made these purchases, but it was more likely that the money had been stolen by the murderer. During the search of his room, they found no new clues. Subsequently, the investigators checked the stores in the mentioned district. In these stores, someone had shopped using Eric's card. Unfortunately, 30 days after the crime, all camera recordings had already been deleted. Due to this standard procedure, an important lead was deleted just a few hours before the police arrived. There was no way to recover the footage, and the material had been overwritten. Thomas was still the main suspect who might have a motive. The investigators called him back to the station to obtain a sample of his signature and compare it with that on the checks used for the purchases. In parallel, his DNA was tested since several hairs had been found in the victim's room. They did not match, however. When checking the signatures, it turned out that they did not fully match the checks, but there was a distant similarity between them. Thomas could not be completely ruled out. Perhaps he simply wanted to change his signature and deliberately wrote in an untypical way. On February 3, 2001 at 4:15 a.m., the fire alarm sounded on campus. However, there was no fire. Nevertheless, all students were brought outside, and a roll call began. It was then learned that there had been a new crime on campus. This time, one of Eric's friends named Ben had been murdered. He was 19 years old. There had been a violent struggle in his room. The young man was bigger than the previous victim and desperately defended himself against his attacker. His murder was even more brutal. As a result of the boy's resistance, the floor, walls, and even the ceiling were saturated with the victim's blood. The crime scene resembled a battlefield. The university was again placed under quarantine so that the police could investigate the case unhindered. The atmosphere at the university was heated to the extreme. Students went home and were afraid to attend the university. It was believed that a madman was on campus killing students. The most unpleasant thing about the whole matter was that the murder took place shortly after the return of the suspect of the first murder, Thomas Minch, to the city. The murdered Benjamin was not completely deaf. He could perceive very loud noises. To enable this, he had undergone prosthetic treatment as a child, which allowed him to partially regain his hearing. He had recently turned 19 and was born in San Francisco. The second victim resembled Eric in many ways. The young man was rather shy and reserved, but friendly and extremely intelligent. As far as sociability was concerned, he didn't like loud parties, but preferred to read. Ben was determined and good-natured, but unfortunately, that didn't save him from the hands of a serial killer. When Thomas arrived in the city, he got to know Eric fairly quickly, and the two began to befriend each other. After his friend's death, he went home for the winter holidays, and it was a critical time because the student was afraid of becoming the next victim. He considered whether he should return to the university and eventually decided to take this step, and soon there was a new murder. After the new crime, the police officers had to go through all the investigative steps that had already been carried out with Eric once again. The second victim had 17 stab wounds to the back, head, neck, chest, and even the eyes. He showed numerous defensive injuries on his arms and palms. He was obviously trying to wrest the weapon from his attacker, but he didn't succeed. He also suffered severe trauma from a blow with a blunt object to his head. Similar to the first act, there were no signs of forced entry into the room. The duty officer on campus informed the police that Ben had repeatedly requested a different room shortly before his death, but the matter was still under consideration. Did he have a good reason for this request? What could be the reason for the room change? All of this was not yet clarified. Thomas was again the main suspect. This time, however, he had a watertight alibi, which was also confirmed. At the time of the crime, he was not on campus as he had much to do in the city. Consequently, the lead investigator decided to start all over again. Everything that had been collected during the first and second investigations was to be reviewed. Something had to connect the victims, and that could be the most important clue. Fortunately for law enforcement, the perpetrator left more traces the second time. Specifically, bloody footprints from size 11 sneakers were found, which allowed them to exclude a large portion of the students on campus who wore shoes of a different size. Even FBI agents got involved in the murder investigations, which attracted a lot of attention. The information was actively disseminated through the media. However, The students were clearly hesitant to cooperate with the police because they were afraid of becoming the next victims. To overcome this hurdle, representatives of the special services offered a reward of $150,000 for clues leading to the clarification of the crime. During the search of a nearby dumpster, a bloody jacket and a knife were found, which was considered the probable murder weapon. But actually, it belonged to the victim. Ben usually used it to peel apples. It became known that the second victim had not attended classes or gone to the canteen since February 1st. The man's checkbook and cash were also stolen. On February 12th, one of the checks was cashed at the bank. It was dated February 2nd. Based on this information, the time of death of the victim could also be determined more precisely. When the police visited the bank where the check had been cashed, they took the camera tapes and began to examine them. On the tapes, the investigators found to their surprise a man. It was Joseph Mesa, a friend of the murdered Eric. He came from Guam and was considered a true patriot, as the flag of his homeland hung over his bed in his room. Joseph had become engaged to his girlfriend even before he came to the university, and after graduation, they wanted to celebrate their wedding. He was generous and helpful and never refused assistance, whether it was about money or a difficult math problem. He was known on campus for his excellent knowledge in the sciences and gladly helped his closest friends solve difficult problems. Could Joseph have been involved in the murders? He had a high reputation among the students, an impeccable record, and was a role model for many. However, Joseph was the one who had received the money after Ben's death, which looked very suspicious. Therefore, he began to be considered a possible perpetrator. The investigators approached him with questions, but the student refused to cooperate in the investigations. However, the investigators managed to obtain a search warrant for his room, where they found bloody clothing and size 11 shoes. Finally, the murderer broke down under the pressure of the evidence. He admitted that he had visited Ben to pick up his checkbook. Joseph saw an apple knife and dealt him the first blow, after which a fight ensued. However, it was not intended for the victim to emerge as the victor from this struggle. Joseph took everything he wanted from Ben's room and disposed of some of his belongings. He also stole one of his former buddy's t-shirts, which he wore over his bloody clothing. During this confession, the perpetrator was cold-blooded and dispassionate. He seemed completely indifferent to what he had done. Gradually, more and more frightening details about his story came to light, e.g. that Joseph didn't take the checkbook immediately, but came back later to get it. During this visit, he stood silently for about 20 minutes in front of Ben's lifeless body. He kept his t-shirt as a bloody souvenir. Joseph also confessed to the first murder on campus and described his attack on Eric. The student had been planning this murder for a long time. When he finally decided to do it, he began the massacre with a chokehold. When the victim lost consciousness, he began kicking him in the head over and over. But that wasn't enough for the perpetrator, so he took a chair and dealt the innocent young man several heavy blows that broke his neck and tore off his scalp. In doing so, the boy spoke quite calmly, as if he were talking about something abstract. He seemed to feel no pangs of conscience or remorse for his act. On February 14, 2001, immediately after his confession, Joseph was in jail without bail. The motive for the act was classified as trivial greed for profit, but the criminal's behavior during the interrogation, his coldness and calmness, were considered signs of a mental deviation. When the relatives of the first victim learned who had massacred Eric, they were shocked. The mother had personally hugged her son's close friend Joseph during the memorial service and accepted his condolences. It turned out that the murderer was a man from Eric's closest circle of friends who had studied math with him. Eric's sister recognized Joseph as the man who had entered her brother's room shortly before the tragedy. The whole incident was also a heavy blow for Thomas Minch. he was crushed by the false accusations of double murder. Many avoided him and whispered behind his back. These murders ruined his studies because the boy was expelled from the university and his future was uncertain. It is not known how events would have developed if Joseph had not confessed to the murder. Perhaps the innocent Thomas could have been put behind bars. This changed his life forever. While Joseph was in custody, some details from his past came to light. He grew up depressed and had an early history as a thief. He had tried several times to be admitted to Gallaudet, each time stealing money from other students. Joseph's psychological problems also came to light. He had personally told a psychiatrist about animal cruelty, specifically that he had stuffed kittens into a bag and then trampled them. The investigators, however, believed that his problem was not the desire to steal, but the desire to kill. But all his statements seemed like an attempt to downplay the responsibility for the acts he had committed. Even during the investigations, Thomas and Eric's family sued both the police and the university itself, accusing them of negligence. However, a judge later ruled that there was no sufficient reason for a lawsuit against the police and the university administration. After all, they had done their job by looking for all possible criminals, and Thomas could indeed have had a motive, and the police's suspicion was not unfounded. Joseph's trial began on May 3, 2002. He claimed to be haunted by hallucinations, which he described as undertakers' hands in black gloves. When they did something, killed or stole, he couldn't resist the call and repeated what he saw in reality. Later, however, it turned out that this was another lie intended to mislead the investigations to evade responsibility by feigning insanity. On May 22nd, a court psychiatrist decided that Joseph was mentally healthy and capable of action. In the trial, all evidence against him was presented, including his confessions, which contained very detailed information about the victims' deaths that only the murderer could have known. It was assumed that he had planned both murders for profit motives. He tried to exploit all available legal loopholes to mitigate his punishment, but this did not succeed. The defendant was found guilty of both premeditated murders. In 2002, Joseph was sentenced to 6 life terms and an additional 90 years for robbery. All this was a heavy blow for all students, faculty, and Gallaudet University. The dormitory where the 2 massacres took place was never used again as a student residence. Thank you for watching, and take care.